Hello, this is Juan Marcos Barrona Gutierrez, and it's January the 1st, 2020. And one of the things that I committed myself to do this year was to start making a large number of videos that would focus in on the books that I write and explaining basically why I've chosen to write on those topics. And the first one that I wanted to sort of highlight in just a short video was Secret Jews, the complex identity of crypto-Jews and crypto-Judaism. Now, this particular book was I guess you could say sort of the outgrowth or the result of my dissertation project at the Spertus Institute of Jewish Studies. And we'll just start off here with a little bit of explanation. You have a front cover image which depicts King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And the individual here is supposed to be Don Isaac Abravanel. And the individual that's here that sort of comes across the scene is supposed to be Torquemada, the Inquisitor General at the time. Now, what had happened was the Alhambra decree had been given by the two monarchs, which basically gave Jews the choice between conversion to Christianity and forced exile. Now, according to the story, Don Isaac Abravanel was trying to plead with the monarchs, and he even offered basically a large financial incentive, if you will, for them to change their minds. And according to legend, at least, Torquemada sort of rushes in and basically says, "Are you going to sell, the church or Christ, for 30 pieces of silver?" And the idea behind the book is quite simple and it's quite fascinating, at least in my opinion. The idea is as follows. At the end of the 14th century, in 1391, there was a very large Jewish community that existed in the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon because they were separate entities. There were also Jewish communities in Portugal that were somewhat smaller. And then there was, I believe, a tiny community in Navarra in the north. There may have been some Jews in Granada in the south, but it was, for the most part, the concentration was in the north. Now, what happened in 1391 changed Jewish history in the peninsula forever. After incitements from a particular archdeacon, whose name was Ferrat Martinez, 80 Jewish communities across the peninsula were attacked, except in Portugal and in Granada. And what happened as a result of that is that about a third of the population converted to Christianity. They converted under duress. And so the book is focused really on that specific issue, but the first chapter focuses in on a broad overview of Jewish history, Jewish history in the peninsula, that is to say. So I basically delve into, the earliest dates that we know that Jews lived in Spain or the Iberian Peninsula from the 3rd and 4th centuries. And then I trace that through different periods of history under Christian rule, under the Visigoths, under the Muslim invaders from North Africa, and then during the Reconquista, which saw a dramatic shift in population concentration of Jews from Muslim-controlled areas to Christian-controlled areas. And then I focus in subsequent chapters, and what I hope to do is maybe develop a video specifically on each chapter to give you some additional information. But what happens eventually is that as a consequence of the conversions, there are different Christian attitudes that develop. And the reason for this is that in the initial days that followed the mass conversions of 1391, it seemed as something miraculous. Something had come true that the church had wanted for quite some time, which was the conversion of the Jewish community to Christianity en masse. And at least for a third of the community, it had actually happened. Now, what happened is that because these individuals were converted under compulsion, under force, in Hebrew, the term anusim is used, forced ones, or under coercion, the sincerity, the commitment to Christianity was obviously not there for most of them. And so what happened is over time, a range of attitudes developed within the Christian community that began to look at these individuals sort of as I guess the term would be sort of a fifth column, individuals who are potentially undermining the integrity of the Catholic Church. And many of these individuals, because they were no longer tied to the restrictions that Jews had increasingly been subject to, were climbing into positions of authority in the city government, in positions of courtiers and financiers to the monarchs, and some even eventually into the church itself. And so there was a resentment, mistrust, and allegations that were levied against them. And in many cases, they were true. They were, in fact, not loyal to the Catholic Church for obvious reasons. They had converted out of duress, out of the desire to save themselves and their families. And so many of them continued to practice Judaism secretly. In another chapter, I discussed the Jewish responses to those conversions. What did they do in terms of how do they perceive these individuals? There's a tremendous amount of material that's called responsa. It's rabbinic responsa. So effectively what happens is a community will write to a rabbi of particular note, a scholar, and they'll ask him a question, and then he'll respond. So the question and the answer are what make up a responsum, a singular responsum, and then responsa is a collection of those different responsums. And one of the things that we see at the end of the 14th century, the 15th, 16th, even to the 17th century, is responsum that are written specifically to deal with the issue of anusim, of forced converts. How do they stand with respect to Jewish law? What about if they marry among themselves and they have a Jewish wedding and the witnesses are other anusim? You sort of have to understand the context of Jewish law and some of the elements of how it works to understand the full impact of this. But there's a tremendous amount of material that's written on that. And as a consequence, what I actually did was I'm coming up with a separate volume that will deal with that more in depth. But in essence, I look into the Jewish perspectives of how they responded. And then I looked at two cases of anusim, of forced converts and their descendants, because it's a self-perpetuating group. The individuals that converted in 1391, and then in some cases, several decades later, their children are still classified under the term conversos. I should have mentioned that in the beginning. Conversos is the Spanish term that means the converted ones. And so they sort of begin to occupy this unique social, economic, ethnic class, if you will. They're technically, legally Christian, but they still have Jewish connections because they live in the same neighborhoods that their family members that did not convert live in. They often marry among themselves. Some of them are what the church calls Judaizing. They're practicing Jewish rituals, often openly, a little brazenly at times. And so you have this third class that develops, or I guess you could say fourth class, depending on how you look at it. You've got old Christian society, you've got Jews, and you've got Muslims. And then in sort of in the middle, you've got these individuals who were Jews one day, and now they've become technically Christian. And so that class begins to grow even as the Jewish community begins to shrink. And so the book features the attitudes of Jews and Christians with respect to this particular group of people. And then sort of moving forward, I begin to look at individuals who maybe have escaped the peninsula. And then we can get into the restrictions and all the issues that arose as a result of that, the Inquisition and so forth. And I look at the specific lives of key individuals because each one of them has their own story, but they seem to reflect a type of response that many of these individuals had. And so that'll be sort of an interesting video in and of itself, just to review some of the people that are mentioned, because their response, once they leave the peninsula is often complicated. It's not necessarily a direct return to Judaism. Some of them sort of struggle with it. Some of them are confused because of, their impression of Judaism was different than what they had envisioned in the peninsula. And if you understand that, when I'm writing about this, I'm talking about individuals that, leave the peninsula 100, 150 years after the expulsion order of 1492. So for 100, 150 years, there haven't been any Jews that have been openly practicing Judaism. So many of these conversos, they retain a memory of the past, of Jewish ritual in some form or fashion. But they also look to elements that are available to them, elements that the Inquisition sort of propagates. And sometimes conversos learn about Judaism, oddly enough, through the very vehicle that has been designed to exterminate it. Sometimes they look to the Bible, sort of almost in a very Protestant fashion. They begin to read the text themselves, and one of the elements of the Catholic Bible, of course, is that it contains the Apocrypha. books like the Maccabees and other books in there that are, of course, they're all Jewish works from the Second Temple period, but they become the lens through which these conversos, these anusim, or these Bnei Anusim, the descendants of Anusim, sort of envision Judaism. And of course, it's a very different type of Judaism because it's a very different era that they're living in. They're not living in the biblical period or in the the late Second Temple period. They're living in the 15th and 16th centuries. But sometimes, they don't have access to other materials, so they sort of fuse their worlds together. You've got a Christian element, a Jewish element, and sort of what they believe to be, or what should be a Jewish element. So anyways, I've thrown sort of many different ideas there together, which sort of illustrates why we need videos on each specific topic, because they're really fascinating topics in and of themselves, every chapter, every story. Now, I'll just sort of end with this because we're sort of getting long. I want to keep these short. I do have another book that's coming out. I have 2 other books on this particular topic. In fact, I have 3 other books on this particular topic. One on the Inquisition, one on the Sabbatean movement and the involvement of conversos, which is sort of another fascinating topic. And I have another one on why did Spanish Jews convert to Christianity? And there's a whole question of did they respond differently than their Ashkenazic, their German Jewish compatriots, or their fellow Jews? Did they respond differently? And then the last book that I'm working on right now is on halachic responsa, on this very topic that I mentioned before. So anyways, I've sort of thrown a lot of material out there, but this is sort of a process for me. I've been sort of camera shy in the past, but I want to overcome that, and I want to put out the material and explain it because I'm very passionate about it. And as many of you know that have been following me, I write on a lot of different topics, not just on Sephardic history, and eventually I will tackle those as well. So we'll see you in the next video, and be prepared to learn.